Recording has started.
Thanks, Catherine. So, hello and welcome back to the 4 Books of Confucian Learning. As you'll remember, last week we started looking at Mencius's theory recognized as his most distinctive contribution because it literally grounds these Confucian virtues in sort of our natural human dispositions. Mencius tells us that our human nature is innately good because all of us is born with these incipient moral qualities, the beginnings of moral qualities. He identifies 4 in particular: humanity, rightness, propriety, and wisdom. And because they're beginnings, he calls them the moral sprouts. And how we know we have these moral sprouts or incipient moral qualities within us is through the thought experiment of an observer who suddenly sees a helpless child about to fall into a well. Everyone would give rise to this feeling of concern, compassion for the poor child, and the spontaneous concern for our to the suffering of others is a sign, evidence of our heart of humanity. So now there are moral sprouts, but they certainly have to be cultivated. They have to be nourished and developed. And that happens through our own concentrated and consistent efforts. It's like trying to master how to play chess. And involves our commitment to following the greater part of ourselves, our hearts, as opposed to our sensory perceptions. Our moral qualities are supported in a conducive environment where we're surrounded by positive role models and you could say mentors, advisors, good friends will give us advice when we're not sure. But at the same time, these moral qualities can be neglected in times when life is so difficult. It can be just a struggle to get by. And we don't have the time or energy to learn about our moral qualities, let alone try and develop them. Or it could be a culture that is such that human beings are completely distracted by the pursuit of material comfort and convenience, that they also don't have much opportunity to develop their moral sprouts. And also, these moral qualities can also be depleted. So they can be neglected, they can even be depleted when we act contrary to the grain of our innate goodness. This brings us to this week. Okay. Where we're how to go about growing moral sprouts, making ethical use of our time, evaluating our heart, reflecting on our thoughts, and extending our caring through empathy, through the practice of reciprocity, which I'll explain through relevant passages from the Mencius. Now, before we look at the passages, I found this interesting 2 book chapters by Professor Donald J. Munro. And he's an American psychologist, professor of philosophy. And he finds that people today are still reading the Mencius as a text to be lived, as a guide to living, which is this approach, historical approach, that the same approach that people took to the text for thousands and thousands of generations. And he predicts that people will continue to look at the text in the same way. Why that is because that Mencius, so much of Mencius's teachings, what he calls Mencius-inspired Confucianism, resonates with and is supported by evolutionary biology. And it's a branch of biology that studies the evolutionary processes that produces the diversity of life. And in particular, as we can read here, Mencius ethics in the new century has an optimistic starting point. Contemporary biologists, psychologists would have no trouble with the Mencius assumption that there's a common human nature. This is important because it affirms that ethics can be grounded in the innate human condition. In other words, certain moral concepts derive from something that is inborn. They're not arbitrary human inventions that are particular to certain cultures or certain communities. In simple terms, contemporary Darwinian and Mencius theories share the position that ethical rules derive from biology, that is, from our hereditary or inborn human nature. And only those ethical rules consistent with human nature will survive in the long term. And biologists would agree. They've written that selection has evidently favored people with motivation or mechanisms, emotional systems, and intellectual capacities that enable us to learn kinship categories. That's sort of family relationships. We often talk about the 5 fundamental categories of human interpersonal relationships. Establish links with others, educate others about genealogical relationships to do with our family, and feel a sense of solidarity and cooperativeness with those identified as relatives, especially with our close relatives, where, as we know from the 4 books of Confucian learning, where we develop our ethical character in our immediate family to begin with. Now, I think that's certainly interesting, and it's very significant for us today, to find that so much of Mencius's teachings resonate with and is supported by contemporary science. Okay, let's take a look at the text. As for how we should spend our time and making ethical use of our time, Mencius here gives us some career advice. He says, is the arrow maker less humane than the armor maker? The maker of arrows worries only that people will not be harmed. The maker of armor worries only that people will be harmed. So it is with the doctor or the healer and the coffin maker. Thus, one must be cautious about one's craft. So the maker of arrows are a form of weapon. They would be concerned all day long about how to make the arrows sharp, fly fast, so they would accurately, strike the target. In contrast, the maker of the armor, let's say the shields, they would be concerned with protecting the people wearing their armor from injury, injury from arrows and other weapons. Completely different sort of mindsets. And so it is with the doctor. The doctor tries to keep their patients healthy, cures them from illness, so they don't die of disease. They can keep on living. But the coffin maker, this is a special type of craftsman or builder. They specialize in the making of coffins. Well, they will only sell another coffin when another person passes away. And so even though, all of these individuals, they're born with the same innate goodness, they have the same heart of humanity, the sprout of humanity, but, they make their living in wanting people to live or die. And Mencius warns that we have to be careful in how we choose our jobs, essentially. And why that matters is because actually, if you think about it, work takes up most days of the week and most of the waking hours of each day when we're at work. So that it's a pretty considerable amount of our time. And we want to try to make sure that what we do at work, the mindset that we have, our attitude in going about our work is not contrary, it doesn't go against the grain of our innate goodness. So now what we do obviously can be detrimental. We should be cautious that it's not detrimental to our innate human goodness, moral sprouts and their development. But there's another solid reason for being careful, and that is the natural law of cause and effect. Because unfortunately, the reality is that whatever we do, we will come to experience the consequences of our actions sooner or later, for better or worse. And so we see many passages throughout the text that Mencius highlights this key concern. I've chosen the next two in particular. Just actually a quote from Confucius. Here is, we know that Confucius said, the person who first made tomb figurines, was he not without posterity? This is because of using something modelled after the human form. How then should it be with a ruler who causes his own people to die of starvation? This is a criticism of I think this is King Hui of Liang, in the state of Wei, actually. And Mencius is quite blunt with him. We'll go on to Mencius's criticism in a moment. But here he quotes from Confucius to basically warn the king of his own misgovernment. And Confucius talks about the inventor of these tomb figurines. Now, previously, these figures would be made of bundles of grass. Later on, they used wood, shaped in the image of a human being, sometimes complete with faces. And I've included the picture of the terracotta soldier. I'm not sure whether any of you travelled overseas or been to a museum to see these terracotta soldiers or the terracotta army from the mausoleum of the first Qing emperor. And they're obviously made from terracotta, not wood or bundles of grass, but they were buried with the king because it was believed that these figures would be able to serve the deceased after their death. Now, okay, you probably think, well, that sounds okay. But unfortunately, this practice of using tomb figurines gave rise to the terrible practice of actually burying live human beings with the body of a dead ruler. Real people were being buried alive. And it has happened, as in the historical case of Lord Moore in the state of Qing. Now, in the next slide, this is one, and you can sort of see the fatal features up close. But with the first Qing emperor's mausoleum, this is just, this is from just all the different, and they all look very, I think they're all these tomb figurines. So the person who invented these tomb figurines, they suffered the terrible consequence of not having any descendants. That was, their own consequence. But other people came to be buried alive through, the start of this practice, this terrible practice. So there are consequences to our actions. And Mencius uses this to warn the king. Let's have a look. What's the problem with the king? In the kitchen, there are fat meat, and in your stables there are fat horses. So the king is enjoying abundance for himself, his family, even his well-fed horses. What's the problem? Well, the problem is that his people are starving, and they've actually died of starvation. This is to lead animals to devour the people. Even the devouring animals by animals is repugnant to people. But if one governs as the father and mother of the people, as the ruler, as the king, and yet is not deterred from leading animals to devour people, in what sense are they father and mother of the people? So, how can you be called the king when you're so clearly neglecting your own people in this way? Now, you can see that for Mencius, the proper aim of government should be the welfare of the people. It's through the state that the people are able to enjoy security, good order, education, etc. And you could say that human beings generally have an obligation to look after each other, just like parents have to look after their children. Now, as the state ruler, the king has even more of a responsibility. The king and his officials have a responsibility to serve and look after the people as their parents. This is a traditional expectation. And so that's why he's talking about being the father and mother of the people. Now, what's happening in the state at the moment? Well, people have starved to death, and that's a symptom of not even being able to provide food, which is, you could say, one of the most basic necessities of human life. If you can't even meet the basic necessities, what sort of a king are you? How are you a father, mother of the people? That's what Mencius is essentially criticizing and telling the king in no uncertain terms. Now, you might wonder, why is this the king's problem? How is this the king's problem? It's the king's problem because probably the king might have disrupted the people from going about the farming activities. So they're not able to grow enough, plant enough, grow enough, or even harvest the crops that they've grown. And that's why they're starving. Or that, they've disrupted the farming activities through either military conscription, where the people are forced to serve in the armies, used to fight on military expeditions to maybe expand the territory of the state, or they've been forced to labour conscription, so forced to work on construction projects, like maybe extending the palace for the king. So either military conscription or labour conscription, they've been taken away from or maybe they've accumulated supplies, but the king has just failed to distribute the supplies from the state granaries. And so end result is people are starving, and they've actually starved to death. It's pretty terrible. So if the king is carrying on in this way, Mencius is sort of using the example, look at the person who invented tomb figurines. This is just burying images of people. You're causing real people to starve to death. How can you expect to, carry on being the king? It's not going to last very long. You need to do something here. It's a real problem. This is not good governance by any measure. So this is, again, Mencius sort of highlighting this cause and effect, being careful about what we do, because there are consequences. Chapter 4, we don't have very much context. We don't know who Mencius was talking to and why he might have said this. But he again quotes from Confucius. And the scenario is, Confucius one day was out with his students. They heard a child singing. This is a nursery rhyme or a children's song. And it's about the waters that come from the river. When they're clear, I can wash the strings of my cap, the cap strings. When the waters are muddy, I can wash my feet. The state of the water, whether it's muddy or clear, determines whether it's used for washing the cap strings or the feet. Now, Confucius picks up on this and tells the students, listen to this, listen up. This is cause and effect. Because by analogy, a person, an individual, or a family, or a state, their good conduct or their misconduct will determine whether they suffer good, they enjoy good fortune or they suffer misfortune. And Mencius even quotes from an authoritative text, and it's the classic of documents, a chapter called Taizia. The line here is, a person might avoid a natural disaster, but they won't survive misfortune of their own making. They can't escape. So basically, people will get their comeuppance sooner or later. So it's best to be cautious with how we spend our time, what we do, especially what we do for our line of work. Now, moving along from the ethical use of our time, Mencius also advises us to evaluate our heart, to reflect on our thoughts. And he likens the practice of humanity to the art of archery. He says, those who practice humanity are like archers. An archer makes sure their stance is correct before shooting the arrow. If their shot fails to hit the mark, they don't resent others who are better than them, more adept. They simply seek the cause within themselves. They will reflect on themselves. Now, archery in the past was actually one of the 6 arts. These 6 arts were considered essential learning for the people in the past. What were the 6 arts? It was rites, which includes, ceremonial etiquette and ritual propriety. Music also included all forms of art, dance, etc. It was also driving, which was controlling a horse or ox-drawn vehicle, like a chariot or a carriage, enable people to get around. Literacy involved learning the Chinese characters, and literary skill, like composing prose, writing, poetry as well, and mathematics. That also included geography, divination, astronomy. So these were sort of subjects of learning that were sort of considered essential for the educated people in the past, to be considered learned, I suppose. And archery was one of them. And archery was traditionally used for hunting, sport, in ritual ceremonies, as well as warfare. So it was a pretty important skill. And if you think about it, the person who an archer needs to mark accurately, but also to shoot with a proper form and conduct. So there were 2 sort of considerations. It obviously takes focus and concentration. Now, if they happen to miss, they have to, reflect on themselves. They can't blame anyone else. It's just them, their bow and arrow, and the target. So they have to think and reflect, where did I go wrong? Correct themselves and practice to improve. So how is this like the practice of humanity? Well, Mencius tells us that, the person who is practicing humanity, they'll sincerely love and care for others. And the natural law of cause and effect tells us that someone who loves and cares for others will naturally is bound to be loved and cared for by others. It, sooner or later, it's a guaranteed consequence. Now, but from time to time, we might tend to come across some people who act unreasonably. Maybe they're unhelpful, unfriendly, annoying. And that's when it is like our arrow missing the mark. So that's when we have to, it's cause for reflection, Mencius would tell us. We have to think, maybe sort of take a step back and think, well, maybe have I inadvertently, unintentionally behaved unreasonably, been inconsiderate to other people? It might not be the same person, other people, or just maybe I've been disrespectful to someone at some point in the past. If the answer is yes, well, we make sure we don't repeat that mistake. We correct. That's the best form of saying sorry. We correct ourselves, and but if the answer is, well, no, we've never been inconsiderate. We've never been, unreasonable or mean to anyone. But we can still take extra care not to prevent that happening in the future. So this idea of reflection and correction, it's an internal process, something that we have to be conscious of, much like the archer, correcting themselves and continuing to practice to improve. So the practice of humanity is like archery. Mencius also shows us by his own example how to go about reflecting our thoughts. If you remember from his Mencius here is talking to King Shen in the state of Qi. King one day was sitting in his hall. He saw someone leading an ox. The ox was very scared, completely frightened, and the king felt moved to order that the ox be released. The ox was actually being led to be sacrificed to consecrate a bell. But the king ultimately decided to use a sheep instead for the sacrifice. Now, Mencius confirms with the king that people thought that the king was being stingy, economizing, trying to save on the cost of sacrificing a large animal and substituting a smaller animal, the sheep, in the place of the ox. But Mencius understands that, yes, it's probably because your majesty could not bear the sight of the frightened ox. The king actually says, it was as if an innocent person was being led to be executed. But Mencius probes further. He asks the king, if you were concerned about, an innocent person being executed, like the poor ox, why did you choose sheep? Are they not the same? The poor sheep would be like an innocent person being taken for execution. And the king sort of thinks back and sort of, I really don't know why I made that decision. And Mencius, after all, we can't expect too much. This is a spontaneous reaction, a sign of the king's moral sprout of humanity, the fact that he can't bear the suffering of another creature. And so Mencius rationalizes and says, well, this was an instantiation of humanity. You saw the ox, but you didn't see the sheep. So the exemplary person, on seeing creatures alive, they cannot bear to see them die. And hearing the sounds, they cannot bear to eat their flesh. So Mencius tries to rationalize it. But the important thing for us here to take away is that Mencius keeps questioning the king, helping him maybe think back, what was going on in your mind? Why did you make this decision? And that's part of the process when we try to reflect on our choices and decisions. Now, in the next passage, Mencius draws our attention to reducing desires. In order to nurture one's heart, the greater part of ourselves or our greater self, there's nothing better than reducing our desires. And in terms of desires, you understand our desires being the bodily distractions. Why that is because bodily distractions in terms of where we simply follow along our sensory perceptions and just enjoy what our eyes see, what our ears hear, what our mouth tastes, for example, without thinking too much. If we try to minimize these distractions, we'll be able to help our heart, the greater part of ourselves, and preserve more of our moral qualities. And where we have many desires, well, we won't be able to preserve, there'll be very few of those moral qualities. Now, innately good human nature that will be preserved. So it has to be a conscious choice, a priority in ensuring that we choose to follow the greater part of ourselves, to achieve the moral excellence and fully realize our innate goodness. So that's about evaluating our heart, reflecting on our thoughts, and trying to minimize the distractions that take away from our heart. In fact, there's an alternative interpretation of this passage where it talks about the desires actually being detrimental to our health. So when we reduce these desires, our heart is at ease and we're able to enjoy better health and, longevity, or live longer. And that's another interpretation. So not just preserving our moral qualities, not just our moral qualities, but our health and longevity in general. Okay. Now, the last, I suppose, area of advice that Mencius provides on cultivating our moral sprouts is extending our caring disposition. Here he talks to, this is in relation to King Xuan in the state of Qi. He tells King Xuan by treating the elders in one's family as elders should be treated, and then extending this to the elders of other families, by treating the young of one's family as the young ought to be treated, and extending this to the young of other families. Well, if you can do this, the whole empire can be effectively governed, as easy as turning something within one's palm. Basically, he's asking the king, advising the king, look, you need to treat the young and old of other families like that of your own. It's as simple as that. And if you can do so, it's actually a win-win situation, because as the state ruler, you're able to set this in, you have such educative influence. You set a good example, a positive example for everyone else. How we know this is Mencius quotes from a poem about King Wen, one of the sage rulers in the past. And King Wen set an example for his wife, his immediate family. It extended to his brothers, and from there to the whole family of the state. He goes on, this poem simply speaks humanity and extending it to others. If you can do that, it's enough to protect all within the four seas, to care for the whole empire. But if you can't do that, you won't be able to even care for your immediate family. The reason why the ancients, the sage rulers of the past, so greatly surpassed others was none other than this. They were good at extending what they did. That's all there is to it. You could say loving your neighbor as yourself. Now, he points out to the king, your kindness extends to the animals, but the benefits don't seem to be reaching the people. Why do you make an exception in the case of the people? So this is talking about extending our caring generally. In the next passage, Mencius talks about extending humanity and rightness. If you can remember from the opening passage to the text, he tells King Hui of Liang that, I have nothing better, nothing more than the teachings of humanity and rightness. So here he's saying that all people have some things that they cannot bear. Humanity is extending that attitude to what they can bear. And all people have some things that they won't do. They won't instinctively not want to do, things that are obviously wrong. And rightness is about extending that attitude to the things that they will do. How does that work? It's about extending, or you'd say extrapolating, from what we instinctively feel concerned about. We are sensitive to the suffering of others, what we cannot bear their suffering, and extending what we would instinctively be unwilling to do, the things that are obviously wrong to us, and extrapolating from that to things that we should feel concerned for, and we should feel unwilling to do. And that obviously takes education. Now, it might sound hard. Mencius also offers three things to be mindful of to help us. If a person can fill themselves with a natural aversion to harming others, their humanity is inexhaustible. So if we can just be mindful of not causing harm to others, that's you could say that's the key to humanity, the practice of humanity. It's not causing harm to others, being compassionate and caring. We might, for example, in our day-to-day routine, when we buy something, we might ask, well, is this product safe? Is it environmentally friendly? That could be an example of not causing harm. But there's also not causing harm on another level, and it's the detrimental effect of not setting a positive example for others, the people around us. For example, we might ask ourselves, well, would I make my family worry about me if I were to do this? Would I feel ashamed if someone found out about this particular activity? If I can ask myself those questions, that will help me ensure that whatever I do, I'm not setting the wrong example, a negative example, and harming others in that way. In fact, Sima Guang, who's the great historian who wrote the Comprehensive Manual for Aid of Government, he lived his life and he was widely admired for living, everything that he said and did. He always ensured that he would not feel ashamed or concerned if someone found out about it. So he lived with a very clear conscience throughout his life. If you listen to Venerable Master's lectures, Venerable Master has said that he asks himself, if everyone were to do what I'm about to do, would that be okay? Let's say you're about to throw some litter on the street. You might think, oh, it's just one piece of litter. I don't have time to find a rubbish bin at the moment. I need to, move on. I need to, I'm running late for something. And it doesn't matter. But if every person in this world did the same thing, well, we would be in even more of a environmental catastrophe than we are already. So that is definitely not okay. That could be another good question to help us be mindful of not causing harm to others, not just physical harm, but the educative influence. And, it could just be the people yes, like our siblings, our cousins, or our friends and colleagues, classmates, all the people around us, and including people who we might not even know, but they hear about what we've done. So that's about being mindful of not causing harm to others. If a person can fill themselves with a natural aversion to breaking through or jumping over a wall, their rightness is inexhaustible. It's basically breaking an enter. And in today's terms, basically an aversion to robbing others, or if you substitute, taking advantage, maybe cheating others, or to give a concrete example, using public or corporate property for private purposes, like taking the company car on a weekend trip. Taking advantage, you're not stealing or robbing someone, but that is also, that can be not permissible, depends on the company policy. I'm just talking generally, obviously. And finally, if a person can fill themselves with a natural aversion to being addressed with disrespect, well, they will not go anywhere without abiding by rightness. Being addressed with disrespect, let's say our name is spelled incorrectly on an important formal document, like a passport. It's a terrible inconvenience. No one likes that when it happens to them. So if we can be mindful of not doing that to somebody else, and this is not just about forms of address, but ensuring that if we have this frame of mind, being mindful of aversion to being addressed with disrespect, we'll ensure that we, in our tone of voice and the way we conduct ourselves, we are considerate, we are thoughtful, we treat people with courtesy, all those basic things. So that's what it means by we won't go anywhere without abiding by rightness. Not just, being polite and respectful, but doing things, not doing things as we shouldn't, or doing things as we should. So these are three key things to keep in mind that can help us in extending our care. And practice of reciprocity. And Mencius here tells us that there's actually nothing closer to humanity than the diligent practice of reciprocity. Sounds like a really difficult term, but it's about understanding others, putting ourselves in their position, in their shoes, as we say, and trying to understand, think from their point of view. No more or no less than that. Confucius himself taught about reciprocity. When his student asks him, is there one word that can guide a person throughout their life? Confucius said, reciprocity. What you do not want others to do to you, do not do to others. It's a variation of the golden rule, as you might have heard of. And this idea, this reciprocity, it's interesting. I've actually highlighted the Chinese character over here, and it's made up of two components. At the bottom is the character for heart, or heart-mind, and above that is the character for as or like. And it's basically about ensuring that a person should use their own feelings as a guide in treating others, not doing to others what we ourselves would not want. And in fact, you might already know, but there's the golden rule. Headquarters in New York. I've got this photo from the United Nations photo collection of this mosaic, and the diversity that we see in the background to the text reflects the fact that this reciprocity actually features among so many of the world's religious, spiritual, and ethical traditions. So I think that's something special. Now, finally, Dai, who is a high officer in the state of Song. Now, Mencius has probably given the state of Song some recommendations, and this particular officer comes back to Mencius. He says, well, this year we're not able to adopt a tax of 10% and to completely abolish the duties, the taxes charged at the borders when people cross the borders into the state and in the marketplaces, like the GST. Well, what do you think about our lightening the tax next year and then abolishing thereafter? So, on the face of it, it sounds reasonable. They can't immediately change the laws throughout the state, but they think, can we go about it gradually, incrementally? What does Mencius say? Mencius uses hypothetical. He says, there's a person who steals chickens from their neighbors on a daily basis. And when they realize, someone actually tells them that this is not how an exemplary person should behave, so they realize that it's wrong, what do? They think, well, how about I just cut back and steal just one chicken a month until next year when I'll stop altogether? What does Mencius mean? If you know that this is not right, something that is not right, then just stop. Why wait until next year? So the state of Song is charging extortionate taxes. These taxes, high taxes, are being levied against the people, against their will. The people are helpless; they can't do anything about it. And it's sort of likened to the stolen goods, the chickens that have been taken without the neighbour's permission or consent. So, if something is clearly wrong, why wait? Why delay? And you should stop and desist immediately, if not immediately, as soon as possible. This is what Mencius is saying. And in the context of our cultivation of character and our cultivation of our moral qualities, our moral sprouts, if we learn that something is detrimental to the growth of our moral sprouts, well, we should stop immediately. Why wait? So we should seize the day. Okay. So we've looked at how to go about growing our moral sprouts, making ethical use of our time, ensuring that we remember to reflect on our choices and our decisions, and evaluating our heart, and extending our caring with empathy or reciprocity, trying to think from the perspective of the other person in all our daily interactions. Now that brings this talk to a close. Thank you very much and see you next week.